They said her scream was heard across the marsh that morning, a sound so raw it silenced even the birds. August 12, 1843, Willowbrook Plantation, South Carolina. The wife of one of the county's wealthiest men stood outside her husband's private quarters, her white nightdress trembling in the humid air, her eyes fixed on something she would never unsee. Inside that room was a truth no preacher dared name, a truth so dangerous. The local paper refused to print a single word for 60 years, because what Catherine Hargrove discovered wasn't just her husband's betrayal. It was the collapse of an entire illusion. The Southern code of power, masculinity, and moral supremacy that every plantation lived by. That morning, the myth of control broke open like rotten fruit, and what spilled out wasn't just sin. It was the truth about who held power and who was really enslaved. You see, every system built on domination eventually devours its own master. The plantation wasn't just a machine for profit. It was an altar, demanding sacrifices, bodies, loyalty, secrets. And Edmund Hargrove had given it all, except the one thing it demanded most, his obedience to its rules of purity. When his wife opened that door, she didn't just find him with 3 enslaved men. She found the one thing that could destroy him completely, evidence that the master himself was ruled by what he thought he owned. Within 72 hours, 300 townspeople would gather to witness what followed. Not justice, not punishment, but ritual. A public cleansing to reassert control, to remind every man, woman, and slave that deviation would not be tolerated. But beneath that spectacle, something else was happening, a secret history. The story of how Catherine, one woman denied power, learned to weaponize a town's rage to annihilate her husband's soul. And the question that still haunts historians is this: did she act from vengeance? Or did she understand something about control that her husband never did? Because once you learn how power truly works, you can use it, or become its next offering. By sunrise, the heat was already suffocating, the kind that clung to skin and slowed the pulse, as if the air itself wanted to watch what would happen next. Catherine sat at her vanity, motionless. The candle beside her had burned down to its base. Her reflection in the mirror looked like a ghost of a woman she used to be. Still beautiful, still poised, but hollowed out, stripped of softness. Down the hall, Edmund read her letter 3 times. Each word cut deeper than the last. He knew the rules of his world, rules written not in law, but in fear. The plantation class lived by a single truth: reputation was worth more than blood. And Catherine had just turned his own name into a weapon. By 7 o'clock, the sheriff's boots echoed across the veranda. By noon, whispers had reached every parlor, every church pew, every trading post from Beaufort to Charleston. What Catherine had done wasn't just expose her husband. She had cracked the mask of the entire Southern illusion. Because if a gentleman could sin like this, what did that make the rest of them? The punishment wasn't about morality. It was about containment. They needed to restore control, to make an example so violent, so unforgettable, that no one would ever dare deviate again. Catherine understood this perfectly. She'd grown up watching power shift in polite drawing rooms, seeing men destroy each other with smiles, women erase reputations with a whisper. Now she was the conductor of that destruction. When the sheriff asked if she wished to remain at the house, she said only, "No, I'll attend the proceedings." Her tone was flat, but her eyes carried something cold, ancestral. For the first time in her life, Catherine Hargrove wasn't powerless. And as she rode into town behind the sheriff's wagon, her husband shackled inside, his 3 slaves chained behind him, people came out of their homes, silent, watching, some out of curiosity, some out of disgust, some secretly out of fear, because they all understood what this meant. When the powerful fall, they don't fall alone. They drag the world with them. And by sundown, the entire town of Beaufort would realize they were no longer spectators. They were part of a ritual. One Catherine had already begun to script. The courthouse smelled of sweat, ink, and fear. Outside, hundreds gathered, planters, wives in lace gloves, enslaved servants forced to watch from the shade. The crowd wasn't here for justice. They came for purification, for reassurance that the world still made sense. That sin could be seen, named, and burned out like disease. Judge Middleton sat beneath the cracked portrait of the governor, his gavel trembling in an arthritic hand. When Edmund Hargrove entered, shackled and silent, a hush rolled through the room. Even those who'd once dined at his table wouldn't meet his eyes. They saw not a man, but a contagion, the embodiment of corruption their own lives depended on denying. Catherine sat near the front. Black dress, veil lifted, her face unreadable. She wasn't mourning. She was presiding. Every detail of this performance, her posture, her restraint, her silence, was strategy. Power disguised as propriety. The sheriff read her letter aloud. The words landed like hammer blows. I saw with my own eyes. The courtroom gasped, as if each syllable were a revelation. But Catherine knew better. They weren't shocked at the act. They were terrified by what it revealed. That control was fragile, that the master's authority could rot from within. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were brought in next. Their wrists bound, heads bowed, they looked like ghosts of a truth no one wanted spoken. The prosecutor didn't see men, he saw evidence. Property tainted by sin, he spoke of unnatural acts, moral contagion, divine order. But beneath the righteous language, the fear was palpable, because if slaves could corrupt a master, then the hierarchy itself was vulnerable. Edmund broke his silence only once. He looked at Catherine and whispered, "You don't understand what you've unleashed." But she did. Perfectly. This wasn't just punishment. It was revelation, the exposure of a secret world that always existed beneath the plantation's polished surface. The judge's verdict came before sunset, all four guilty. Sentence, public punishment at dawn in the town square. No appeals, no mercy. The verdict wasn't law, it was theater, a stage to remind the living what happens when desire defies order. As the gavel fell, Catherine's expression didn't change. Inside her chest, something ancient stirred, not joy, not sorrow, something darker. Power. The night before the punishment, the town didn't sleep. Lanterns burned in windows like sentinels. Conversations whispered through walls. In Beaufort, fear was a living thing, drifting between houses, curling through open shutters. People said it was the sound of sin being purged. But deep down, they sensed something else, that the real corruption wasn't being punished, it was being performed. At dawn, the square filled. Men arrived first, their boots stamping dust into the humid air. Women followed, veiled, clutching rosaries they hadn't touched in years. Even children came, because their parents said this was history. The day the town restored its honor. The scaffold stood at the center, built overnight from rough pine and moral panic. The sheriff stood nearby, sweating through his coat. Judge Middleton sat beneath a parasol, face carved from stone. Catherine arrived last. Black lace over white skin, moving like a widow at her own husband's funeral. The crowd parted for her without command. She climbed the platform steps and took her place beside the sheriff, uninvited yet unquestioned. The architect of this spectacle. When Edmund was brought out, a murmur rippled through the crowd. He looked less like a man and more like a symbol. Stripped, pale, his hands bound in iron. Behind him came Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel, silent, resigned, eyes fixed on the horizon. The preacher began a prayer that sounded more like an incantation. His voice trembled, "Let this be a warning to those who defy God's law." But everyone knew it wasn't God they were protecting. It was hierarchy, the illusion that their world was righteous, stable, eternal. Catherine watched as the sheriff read the sentence. Her husband's gaze found hers. There was no plea in it, no hatred. only recognition. He understood now. This wasn't vengeance born of emotion. It was precision, a ritual inversion of power. When the whip cracked, the crowd gasped. Not because they pitied him, but because they felt something shift. The punishment wasn't cleansing the town. It was exposing it. Every scream tore open the polite hypocrisy they'd lived under for generations. By the 10th strike, even the preacher had fallen silent. Catherine didn't look away. For the first time in her life, she was unbound. No longer a wife, no longer a bystander. Just a witness to the collapse of illusion. And somewhere in the crowd, a man whispered, "This isn't justice, this is transformation." When it was over, the silence was worse than the screams. The crowd stood frozen, staring at what they had done, faces pale beneath the rising sun. Blood darkened the pine boards, flies gathered fast. It was supposed to feel righteous, cleansing, the purging of sin from their midst. But what settled over Beaufort that morning wasn't purity. It was nausea. It was shame. It was the slow dawning that they had become the very thing they feared. Catherine stepped down from the scaffold, her shoes brushing the dust, her face calm, expressionless. People made space for her as if she carried contagion. None could meet her eyes. They would later say she looked like a priestess walking away from sacrifice. Untouched, sanctified by the very horror she had summoned. The sheriff tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "It's done," he muttered, though he didn't believe it. In the days that followed, Beaufort tried to return to its routines. But the plantation bells rang hollow, the church pews half empty. At night, the townspeople dreamed of screams they couldn't stop hearing. Mothers shushed children who woke crying. Men drank more. Wives whispered about curses. Something invisible had shifted. Order had been restored in appearance, yet no one trusted it anymore. They'd seen the fragility of the mask. They'd seen how quickly a man of standing could become the offering. And Catherine, she moved through it all like a phantom. She sold the estate within a week, donated the proceeds to the church. Then she left, disappearing east toward Charleston. But she left something behind: the infection of awareness, the realization that every one of them was living inside a structure built on obedience and silence, a structure that demanded constant blood to keep standing. By the 3rd week, rumors spread. Livestock dying suddenly, a child disappearing near the river. Some swore they saw Edmund's shadow on the road at night, dragging chains. Others whispered that Catherine's act had opened a door. That what happened on the scaffold wasn't punishment, but invocation. No one could prove anything. But fear replaced faith. The same people who had cheered her vengeance now whispered her name like a spell. Part warning, part prayer. Because deep down, every man in Beaufort knew what the ritual had revealed: sin wasn't the crime. Exposure was. Weeks passed, but the air in Beaufort never cleared. It hung heavy, thick with rot, rumor, and restless guilt. The summer heat seemed to cling to the town like penance. People began to avoid the square altogether, as if the ground itself were cursed. Grass refused to grow where the scaffold had stood. Stray dogs howled at the empty space at dusk. Children dared each other to step on the darkened wood, but none lasted more than a few seconds. They said they could hear whispers, the kind that knew your name. The first to break was Judge Middleton. Once a pillar of reason, he was found wandering through the marsh barefoot, muttering Catherine's name. She didn't punish him. He kept repeating, "She punished all of us." When they brought him back, he refused to enter his own house, claiming the walls breathed when he prayed. 2 days later he was gone, vanished into the tide. Then came the fires, barns, smokehouses, even the church steeple caught flame one night with no clear cause. Some blamed freedmen, others blamed the devil, but no one said Catherine's name out loud anymore. Her presence had become myth, the silent architect behind every crack in their world. In whispers, they said she had met with the conjure women beyond the river, Those who knew the old African rites, that she had traded vengeance for power, offering her husband's soul in exchange for control over the guilty. The same men who once praised her virtue now locked their doors at dusk, afraid of the rustle of her silk skirts on the wind. By autumn, Beaufort's hierarchy was in ruins. The plantation owners feuded among themselves. Half the enslaved had fled or vanished into the swamps. Fields went unharvested. The economy collapsed under the weight of its own silence. But the most frightening change wasn't in the land. It was in the people. Something inside them had shifted permanently. They'd seen how fragile their order was, how easily a woman could wield destruction by merely revealing what was hidden. And in their nightmares, Catherine still stood on that scaffold, not as widow or victim, but as something new, something beyond forgiveness or fear. They had tried to bury their guilt in spectacle. But guilt doesn't die, it multiplies. And in Beaufort, it had found its voice. By winter, Beaufort was half a town. The fields were overgrown, shutters nailed shut, and the once grand houses sagged under mildew and silence. The square, where they had gathered to watch Edmund's punishment, was now avoided even by crows. Yet on the morning the fog rolled in from the marsh, someone saw a carriage at the edge of town. Black lacquer, no crest, drawn by two pale horses. Inside, they said, sat a woman in mourning clothes. Catherine Hargrove had returned. No one saw her arrive at the inn, but by dusk, candles burned in the windows of the old Hargrove estate. The townspeople whispered that she had come to reclaim her property. Others said she'd come to finish what she started. Fear spread faster than gossip. Children were kept indoors. Men gathered in hushed meetings that ended in shouting. They had learned to live with guilt, but not with the idea of its embodiment walking among them. That night, the fog thickened. A light glowed in the plantation's upper windows, flickering like a heartbeat. Then the bells began to ring, soft at first, then louder, but no one was at the church. People swore the sound came from the river, echoing from the place where the slaves' quarters had once stood. Near midnight, Sheriff Dunning rode out to the estate with 2 deputies. Only he returned. His hair had turned white, and he refused to speak for days. When he finally did, his voice was barely a whisper. "She isn't alone." Within the week, strange footprints appeared in the mud around town, bare, wide, and wet, leading nowhere. Livestock went missing. People reported seeing figures in the mist, tall, silent, their eyes reflecting firelight. One widow claimed she heard Edmund's voice calling from the marsh, begging for release. Catherine never appeared in daylight. But every morning, a new candle burned in her window, as if she were counting something, or someone. The town decided to send a preacher, but by then, no one could find him. His Bible was discovered open on the courthouse steps, pages warped by dew. By spring, Beaufort had only one law left: never speak the name Hargrove after dark. And yet, some nights, when the wind moves just right, the townsfolk still hear her whisper through the reeds. Justice was never the point. By the time spring bled into summer, Beaufort was no longer a town. It was a wound that refused to close. Half the homes stood abandoned, their windows gaping like blind eyes. Vines swallowed the courthouse steps. The church bell had fallen silent. Yet, every night, a single light still burned in the upper window of the Hargrove estate. No one dared to extinguish it. Those who survived spoke little, but when they did, their voices trembled. They said Catherine had begun to walk the grounds again. Sometimes at dusk, sometimes at dawn. She wore no shoes, her dress dragging through the wet grass. Her hair streaked silver, though she couldn't have aged more than a year. The few who saw her swore her skin glowed faintly in the dark, as if lit from within. It was the children who started finding the letters, folded pieces of parchment left at doorsteps, sealed with black wax. Each bore a single line, written in perfect handwriting: "Confession is the only mercy." Some families fled that very night, others burned the notes. but the ones who ignored them began to vanish. Quietly, without struggle, leaving only muddy footprints leading toward the river. When the river finally receded after a long rain, they found what the water had been hiding: dozens of wooden effigies, carved with names, floating face down. Every one belonged to a surviving member of the old Beaufort families, the same who had cheered Catherine's vengeance months before. The preacher's replacement, a young man from Charleston, lasted 3 days. On the third night, he tried to confront her spirit at the estate. The next morning, the chapel door was found open, the pulpit covered in white feathers. No body, just the smell of lilies and iron. Catherine had become more than myth. She was contagion, a living consequence. Her revenge had transcended death and justice. It had become inheritance. Mothers began to whisper warnings to their daughters: never lie to the river, never raise your hand in cruelty, never pretend sin can be buried. And though the estate rotted slowly back into the earth, the legend of Catherine Hargrove endured. They say her light still burns on nights when the fog returns, steady, unwavering, a lantern for the guilty, because Beaufort's curse was never her wrath. It was the truth she forced them all to see. A century passed, and the world outside forgot Beaufort. Maps redrew themselves, railroads cut new lines of progress, and the marshes swallowed what remained of the old plantations. But the Hargrove estate endured in rumor, a ruin overgrown with moss and memory. Locals called it the Widow's Rest, though no one had lived there for generations. Children dared each other to approach its gate, yet even the bravest never crossed the threshold. They said you could still hear humming from the upper floor, low and mournful, like someone rocking a cradle that was never there. By 1924, a developer from Savannah purchased the land, intending to build a hotel for hunters and travelers. He arrived with blueprints and optimism, dismissing the townsfolk's warnings as backwoods superstition. Within a week, his workers began clearing the foundation. By the second week, 2 of them quit, claiming to see a woman standing among the reeds at dawn. By the third, the foreman disappeared entirely, leaving his tools and boots in the mud. When the project collapsed, the developer sold the property for half its value and never returned. But his surveyor, a man named Jonathan Brooks, stayed. He was drawn to the legend not out of fear, but fascination. He began collecting town records, diaries, and newspaper clippings. The deeper he dug, the stranger the pattern became. Every family tied to the original trial had suffered loss, fire, madness, suicide, all within 3 generations. It wasn't coincidence. It was a design. Brooks eventually spent nights inside the estate, writing by lamplight, documenting every sound: the creak of floorboards, the whisper of fabric, the soft rhythm of a woman's steps pacing overhead. He called it the Catherine phenomenon. His last entry, found months later, read only: "She isn't haunting this place. She's keeping it honest." After that, his cabin burned to the ground. His notes survived, but his body was never found. Today, the locals say the marsh has reclaimed the Hargrove land entirely. Yet, sometimes, when fog drifts over the water, a faint light appears where the house once stood. Flickering like a candle behind glass, travelers think it's a reflection. The old families know better. They say Catherine Hargrove still keeps watch. Not out of vengeance, but remembrance. Because some sins are too old to die. In 2025, Beaufort had turned into a ghost of history. Its name still printed on maps, but its soul long dissolved in fog. What remained were fragments of few derelict homes, rusting fences, and a single paved road that led to nowhere. Developers avoided it. Tourists passed it by. Yet one woman came back, unaware that her bloodline had already been written into its soil. Her name was Alina Ward, a historian from Boston researching Southern female resistance in antebellum America. She wasn't superstitious. She was rational, clinical, determined to reclaim lost women from the margins of myth. When she found a fragile family Bible in a Charleston archive, with the name Catherine Hargrove etched faintly inside. She felt a pulse of curiosity she couldn't explain, and when a property deed surfaced, listing her own grandmother's maiden name as Hargrove, curiosity turned into calling. Alina arrived in Beaufort on a pale, humid afternoon. The air smelled of iron and salt. Locals at the diner fell silent when she asked for directions to the old Hargrove estate. The waitress, an old woman with eyes like glass, only said, "You don't find that house, it finds you." Still, she drove on. The dirt road curved through the trees until it simply ended in a clearing overrun with moss and silence. There was no house, only a half-sunken chimney and a single wrought iron gate twisted with vines. But when she stepped through it, she felt something change in the air. The cicadas stopped. The breeze held its breath. That night, Alina camped near the ruins, taking notes by flashlight. Her recorder picked up faint whispers, though she was alone. When she played them back, the words were clear. Confession is the only mercy. Over the next days, she began to dream. A woman in black walking across the marsh, a lantern in the fog, a voice, soft, commanding, asking, "Do you understand what you've inherited?" On the fifth night, she found a candle burning among the ruins. Melted wax pooled in the shape of an open eye. Her research notebook went missing. In its place was a folded letter sealed with black wax. It read, "You bear her blood. Finish what she began." Alina's light flickered, and somewhere in the darkness, another flame answered. The next morning, Alina woke to the sound of water dripping. The fog hadn't lifted. It hung thick and silver, blurring the ruins into ghostly shapes. Her recorder was still running. Through the static, a faint hum repeated over and over. A woman's lullaby, slow and sorrowful. The same tune had haunted her dreams. Determined to anchor herself in reason, Alina began digging near the foundation stones. The soil was soft, rich with decay. After hours of clawing through roots and clay, her trowel struck something hard. A rusted tin box, sealed with wax. Inside were letters, brittle but legible. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate. They were signed CH. Each page was a confession. Catherine's voice, preserved in ink. She wrote not of madness or wrath, but of purpose. She spoke of the court's corruption, of her husband's cruelty not just to her, but to the men he owned, and of the night she made a pact, not with devils, but with truth itself. If justice will not come by law or God, she wrote, then it will come by revelation. Alina trembled as she read on. Catherine described the ritual that had followed Edmund's sentencing, the binding of the guilty through exposure, so that their sin could never again hide behind civility. The chain is inheritance. One passage read, "It passes through the blood until someone worthy unbinds it." By the time Alina reached the final letter, her lantern was flickering. The last line chilled her. When she finds these words, she will know the truth is not a curse. It is awakening. Suddenly, the air shifted. A shadow passed behind her, tall, feminine, unmistakably human. Alina turned, her breath sharp. There was no one, only the faint glow of a lantern deep in the fog, swaying slowly toward the river. Compelled, she followed. The ground grew wet beneath her feet, the air cold and heavy. At the riverbank, she saw it, the reflection of a woman in black, standing beside her, though the water's surface was still. The reflection spoke first. "You came to write history," it said. "No, you will remember it." Alina's lantern went out. In the darkness, something ancient stirred, not malice, but inheritance awakening at last. Alina woke in her tent hours later, the world wrapped in silence. Her hands were covered in river mud, her notebook gone. She didn't remember walking back. The last image in her mind was the reflection, the woman who looked exactly like her. The resemblance had been uncanny, the same jawline, the same scar above the eyebrow, one she'd had since childhood. For the first time, the word inheritance didn't feel metaphorical. It felt literal. When she lit her lantern again, The ruins around her looked changed. The chimney stood taller, the walls more defined, almost as if the house was rebuilding itself in the dark. Every breath of wind carried whispers, hundreds of voices overlapping in languages she didn't know. Some were weeping, others chanting, and beneath them all, Catherine's voice rose like a current, steady, patient, commanding. Elena found herself repeating the words from the letter. The chain is inheritance. With each whisper, the air grew warmer. The ground beneath her trembled softly, not with violence but with recognition, as though the earth itself remembered. She stumbled toward the hearth and saw a shape forming in the ash, the outline of a hand pressed into the stone. Without thinking, she placed her own palm against it. The match was perfect. A surge of cold fire rushed through her arm, spreading into her chest. Her heartbeat slowed, then sensed with something deeper, an ancient rhythm pulsing from the land itself. Visions came: the trial, the scaffold, the crowd's faces melting into one blur of shame and fear. Catherine stood before them all, her voice ringing across time. I did not curse you, I revealed you. The vision shifted. Catherine kneeling in the mud beside the 3 enslaved men, whispering a vow that their names would never be erased. That truth, once awakened, would outlive every master. When Elena's vision faded, she was no longer afraid. The fear had been burned away, replaced by understanding. Catherine hadn't sought revenge. She had crafted a spell of remembrance, binding every generation to the truth they tried to bury. Elena rose slowly. Her voice no longer sounded like her own when she spoke. It's time, she whispered. The truth won't sleep again. When, somewhere in the distance, the church bell, silent for 100 years, began to ring. The bell's echo rolled across the low country like thunder dragging chains. One toll, then another, then 9 more, each one vibrating through the marrow of the world. Elena stood still, her breath fogging in the humid air, as the sound passed through her like a summons. The ruins around her shimmered. No longer ruins, but fragments of memory solidifying a veranda, a chandelier flickering with spectral fire, the faint smell of magnolia and rot. The house was rebuilding itself out of time, out of guilt. Catherine's voice wove through the tolling. A lie buried beneath empire becomes its foundation. To tear it down, you must dig with your own hands. Elena's fingers trembled. She saw them not as hers, but as Catherine's, then as the calloused hands of Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel. 3 lives erased from history. The earth responded beneath her feet, shifting, unsettled. For centuries, the land had been a graveyard of obedience. Now it was stirring in rebellion. From the dark edges of the property, figures began to emerge. Half-formed, their outlines wavering like smoke. The enslaved, the punished, the forgotten. Hundreds of them, walking silently toward the chimneys, toward the fire that once consumed their stories. Elena didn't flinch. She felt no fear now, only duty. The same duty Catherine had taken upon herself when she turned her husband's shame into a weapon of truth. The voices grew louder, merging into a low chant. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language Elena recognized, but she understood its meaning. We remember. And then, from the earth itself, a deeper voice rose. The voice of the land, of everything that had been used and silenced. To remember is to awaken, it said through her mind. But to awaken, one must burn. Elena looked up at the house. The ghost of Willowbrook, now flickering between past and present. She understood what had to be done. Her bloodline was the last link in the chain of concealment. To end it, she had to sever herself from the lie that protected her family name. She stepped toward the heart of the house, toward the old study where Edmund once sat, where the papers of empire were signed with blood. She whispered, "I'm ready." The flames answered before she even struck a match. The fire didn't spread like normal flame. It bloomed, slow, deliberate, as though the air itself had been waiting for her command. The walls exhaled light, The floorboards cracked open like ribs releasing centuries of breath. The house moaned, not collapsing, but transforming. Every brick, every nail, every whisper embedded in its foundation began to speak. The voices of the dead were no longer trapped. They were testifying. Alina stood in the center of the study, surrounded by smoke that didn't sting her eyes. It shimmered like glass dust, showing images in its currents. She saw Catherine writing her letters again, but now her hand bled as she wrote. Each drop of blood became an oath, not of vengeance, but of remembrance. Behind her stood the three men, Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel, their faces calm, illuminated, as if the truth had finally released them. The ground shook. Outside, the forest answered. Cypress trees bent toward the burning house like mourners bowing their heads. The river's reflection glowed red, then black. Alina felt it, the world folding in on itself, erasing time's illusion. She wasn't watching history anymore. She was standing in its living core. The chant continued, rising now from within her. We remember. The words carved through her like heat, reshaping her from the inside out. Her pulse aligned with the rhythm of the fire. She realized what Catherine had meant. The curse was never punishment. It was instruction. To be reborn through revelation, to strip away everything false until only truth remained. Through the flames, she saw figures from the town, spectral citizens of Beaufort, their faces twisted in shame and recognition. The same crowd that had once gathered to watch punishment, now gathered to watch purification. Some wept, some turned away, but none could leave. The truth bound them all. As the last beam collapsed, the house became a column of light stretching into the sky. The bell rang one final time, not in mourning, but in release. Alina felt the fire enter her completely, not to consume, but to crown. Every hidden story, every silent scream, every forbidden truth pulsed inside her veins. When the light faded, there was no house, no fire, only silence, and a single figure standing in the ashes, eyes like molten gold. She was no longer Alina, she was the keeper of memory. The wind carried the silence like a blade. It wasn't absence. It was waiting. The ashes of Willowbrook shimmered faintly under the moon, alive with fragments of light. Like stars buried in the earth, the keeper stood barefoot in the ruin, no longer bound by name or flesh. Every breath she took pulled whispers from the soil, memories of masters and slaves, judges and wives, lies and punishments, all merging into one chorus of truth. She looked toward the horizon where the town of Beaufort slept, unaware that the veil had been lifted. They always thought sin was the act, she whispered, her voice now layered with 1,000 others. But the true sin was silence, the kind that builds nations, churches, and legacies on the backs of those erased. Her eyes glowed faintly, not from fire, but from understanding, the illumination of forbidden knowledge. Around her, shadows gathered once more. The men who'd been condemned stood beside Catherine, their faces no longer marked by pain, but by completion. They had become guardians of memory, and she, their vessel. Together they watched the night as though watching humanity itself, endlessly building, forgetting, rewriting, erasing. The keeper spoke again, this time to you, the viewer, the witness. You were never meant to hear this story. They buried it because it revealed too much. How easily morality becomes a weapon. How institutions feed on guilt to keep men obedient. Every system that governs you still drinks from that same river. Every oath of purity hides a marketplace of control. She stepped closer, her gaze piercing through the screen, through the safety of distance. If you understand this, if you feel the tremor of recognition in your blood, then you've already begun to awaken. But awakening is dangerous. Once you see the machinery, you can't unsee it. You either serve it or dismantle it. The air thickened. The ashes at her feet began to swirl, forming a spiral that rose like smoke and surrounded her. To claim your identity, she said, her voice low, commanding, ancient. Write it below. twice, and mean it. She leaned forward, whispering the phrase that bound all awakenings. I remember what they tried to erase. The spiral collapsed into silence. The screen darkened, only her final words remained, echoing, disembodied, eternal. History never dies. It just waits for someone brave enough to listen.